Ma'am, who are you and what are you doing in this house?
This is my home. What seems to be the problem?
We got reports of suspicious activity. I need your ID.
On what legal basis?
Just cooperate, ma'am.
The morning coffee was still hot and steaming when Judge Patricia Williams heard loud noises coming from outside her front door. She had been getting ready for another busy day on the federal bench carefully, going through case files for an afternoon sentencing hearing. When she heard heavy footsteps on her porch, she stopped what she was doing. Moments later, harsh and aggressive knocking echoed through the house. Knocking that would soon change her life forever. What happened next would ruin 2 police careers, send shockwaves through the justice system, and show the nation that even people who wear the robes of justice are not protected from the darkest forms of prejudice. The body camera footage recorded that Tuesday morning would later gain more than 25 million views, lead to congressional hearings, and bring the toughest punishments ever handed down for racial profiling in the history of her state. Judge Patricia Williams was not an ordinary person. At 52 years old, she had spent the last 10 years serving as a federal judge, appointed by the president himself. Before that, she worked for 8 years as a district attorney, handling some of the most difficult criminal cases in the region. Her reputation was flawless. Lawyers on both sides of the courtroom respected her work and her fairness. She lived a quiet life in an upscale neighborhood, drove a simple sedan, and was known by her neighbors as the woman who organized the yearly block party and helped elderly residents carry their groceries. That Tuesday morning began just like any other. Judge Williams woke up early, went on her usual jog through the tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, and returned home to get ready for work. She lived in a beautiful colonial-style house she had bought 3 years earlier, with a neatly trimmed lawn and flower beds she personally cared for on weekends. Nothing about her daily routine suggested trouble, conflict, or drama. At exactly 7:23 a.m., officers Daniel Reeves and Marcus Thompson pulled into her driveway. They claimed they were responding to a report of a suspicious person. According to them, someone had called about a black woman who supposedly did not belong in the neighborhood, someone who was seen entering and leaving the house at unusual hours. The truth was, no such call had ever been made. What really happened was this: Officer Reeves had been driving through the wealthy neighborhood during a routine patrol when he noticed Judge Williams returning from her morning jog. Seeing a confident, successful black woman in athletic clothes, clearly comfortable in this affluent area, triggered something in his mind. He radioed his partner, Officer Thompson, and made up a story about a suspicious person report asking for backup. That single decision would become the most costly mistake of both officers' careers. Judge Williams opened her front door, wearing her silk robe, holding a mug of coffee. She expected to see a neighbor, or maybe a delivery worker. Instead, she was face to face with 2 uniformed police officers standing stiffly, their hands resting on their belts in an intimidating way. Officer Reeves immediately demanded to know who she was and what she was doing inside the house. Confused, but calm, Judge Williams asked if there was some kind of problem. Reeves ignored her question and repeated his demand for identification. When she asked why they were at her home, Officer Thompson stepped forward and claimed they had received reports of suspicious activity at that address. At that moment, Judge Williams made a decision that would turn out to be a brilliant one. Instead of immediately telling them she was a federal judge, she chose to see how the officers would treat someone they believed had no power or authority. She calmly explained that this was her home and asked what exact suspicious activity had been reported. The officers couldn't give clear answers because there had never been a real report. Reeves nervously mentioned that someone did not seem to belong in the neighborhood. Thompson added that they needed to confirm she had the right to be there. When Judge Williams asked if they had a warrant or any legal reason to demand entry into her home, both officers became visibly irritated. Officer Reeves accused her of having a suspicious attitude and said that cooperative citizens didn't ask so many questions. Thompson warned her that refusing to comply could lead to arrest. Judge Williams stayed calm and firm, stating that she was simply exercising her constitutional rights inside her own home. That was when Officer Reeves made his second catastrophic mistake, that he shoved past Judge Williams and walked into her house without permission, saying he needed to check if anyone else was inside. Thompson came in right behind him. Now, both officers were illegally standing inside a federal judge's private home. Judge Williams did not fight them, but she clearly said they were entering without her consent and without a warrant. Then she pulled out her phone and started recording. The second that camera appeared, Officer Reeves snapped. He barked at her to stop recording immediately. When she refused, he reached for her phone. What these officers didn't know was that Judge Williams had installed an expensive top-level security system just 6 months earlier. Her front porch, living room, and kitchen were all being filmed from multiple angles in high definition, with crystal clear sound. Every illegal step, every violation of her rights, and every word they spoke was being captured and automatically saved to the cloud. Later, the video would show Officer Reeves ripping the phone from Judge Williams's hands and throwing it across the room. It would show Thompson digging through her personal belongings with no legal reason. It would catch them demanding she prove she lived there, while they stood in her own living room without permission. But the worst part of the footage still hadn't happened. When Judge Williams asked for their badge numbers and the name of their supervisor, Officer Reeves completely lost control. The racist slurs that came out of his mouth next would end his career and eventually send him to federal prison. And instead of stopping him, Thompson joined in, adding his own disgusting comments about people who didn't know their place. They told her that big houses and expensive neighborhoods were not meant for people like her. They said she must be selling drugs or prostituting herself to afford the mortgage. Their words were so hateful that when the footage was later played in court, several jurors physically pulled back in shock. Judge Williams took this abuse for almost 20 minutes. She recorded everything while staying unbelievably calm. She never screamed. She never argued. She never answered their hate with anger. She simply kept asking again and again for their badge numbers and their supervisor's contact information. When the officers finally stopped their illegal search and found nothing, because there was nothing to find, they started getting ready to leave. But Officer Reeves still wasn't finished. He told Judge Williams that if he ever saw her in that neighborhood again, she would be arrested for trespassing. He said the real homeowner, whoever it was, would be contacted and warned about a suspicious black woman trying to break into their house. That was when Judge Williams finally decided to tell them who she was. She walked into her home office, brought back her judicial credentials, and placed them on the coffee table right in front of both officers. The expressions on their faces, the moment they realized what they had done, would later become famous in law enforcement training circles. Officer Reeves turned pale. Officer Thompson slowly backed toward the door. Both men suddenly looked like they had forgotten how to speak. Judge Williams stayed calm. She told them that everything they did had been recorded, that they had broken multiple federal laws, and that she would file complaints with every agency that mattered before the day was even over. Have you ever watched someone's whole world fall apart in real time? Drop a comment if you've ever seen a moment like that. The officers almost ran out of her house, but the damage was already done. There were 23 minutes of video showing 2 police officers committing multiple felonies against a federal judge. The proof was solid. The violations were obvious, and the consequences were going to be fast and brutal. But Judge Williams was only getting started. Less than 30 minutes after the officers left her property, Judge Williams was on the phone with the FBI. As a federal judge, she had direct access to the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, and they took her call right away. She gave a quick summary of what had happened and explained that she had strong video evidence of multiple federal crimes. The agent who answered was Special Agent Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran who focused on police misconduct cases. Santos had handled dozens of civil rights investigations, but she had never heard anything like this. 2 local officers had just committed federal crimes against a sitting federal judge in her own home, and it was all on video. Agent Santos arrived at Judge Williams's house within 2 hours, bringing a technical specialist and a civil rights prosecutor with her. They spent 4 hours going through the security footage, taking careful statements, and writing down every detail of what had happened. The prosecutor, David Chen, kept slowly shaking his head as he watched the video. In his 15 years handling police misconduct cases, he had almost never seen proof this strong or violations this outrageous. While all of that was happening, Officers Reeves and Thompson went back to their precinct in total panic. They knew they had made a terrible mistake, but they didn't understand how serious it really was until they started looking up who Judge Patricia Williams actually was. And what they learned made everything much worse. Judge Williams wasn't just a federal judge. She was the chief judge of the federal district court, which meant she oversaw federal criminal cases across the entire region. During her time on the bench, she had handled hundreds of cases involving police misconduct. She had sentenced corrupt officers, signed off on search warrants, and ruled on major constitutional violations. Her understanding of federal law was deep and detailed, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by something else. She was absolutely unforgiving when it came to anyone violating the Constitution. By the time Reeves realized that, he was already falling apart. He called in sick for the rest of the week. Thompson asked for emergency vacation time. Both men rushed to hire lawyers they couldn't really afford, hoping they could somehow limit the damage. They couldn't. By Thursday morning, the story was national news. A federal judge had been racially profiled, harassed, and illegally searched inside her own home by local police officers. Judge Williams had approved the release of the video, and now the footage was running on every major news network. Legal experts were calling it one of the clearest, most undeniable cases of police misconduct ever recorded. That same afternoon, Police Chief Robert Martinez held an emergency press conference. He announced that both officers had been suspended without pay while a full investigation took place. He called their actions inexcusable and promised that the department would fully cooperate with federal authorities. But to the public, his words sounded empty. People had heard promises like that too many times before. What made this case different wasn't only the crystal-clear video or the high-profile victim. It was what happened next, something that sent shockwaves through law enforcement across the country. The FBI didn't just investigate that one incident. They launched a full review of the entire police department's behavior and policies. They subpoenaed records going back 5 years. They interviewed dozens of officers and civilians. They studied arrest trends, complaint files, and internal messages. And what they found showed a pattern that went far beyond two bad apples. The data revealed that black residents in wealthy neighborhoods were stopped and questioned at rates 17 times higher than white residents. Internal emails showed supervisors making jokes about certain types of people not belonging in nice areas. Training materials included coded language that basically taught officers to treat successful black citizens as automatically suspicious. Then another ugly truth came out. Officer Reeves had already built a long history over the past 3 years. He had 12 complaints for racial profiling. Most were dismissed, and the rest ended in tiny punishments like verbal warnings. One complaint came from a black neurosurgeon who was stopped while jogging in his own neighborhood. Another came from a black family questioned while unloading groceries outside their own house. Officer Thompson's record looked just as bad. He had 9 complaints in 4 years, and they all followed the same pattern. Both men had been protected by a system that valued loyalty more than accountability. Now that system was about to crash. A federal grand jury was formed within just 3 weeks, the fastest turnaround the district had ever seen. 18 citizens listened to testimony from Judge Williams, watched the security footage, and heard expert witnesses explain exactly which federal laws had been broken. When it was time to decide, the jury didn't take long. Their deliberation lasted less than 4 hours. The indictments hit like a bomb. Officer Reeves was charged with 7 federal crimes, including civil rights violations under color of law, illegal search and seizure, criminal, trespass, assault, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. Each charge carried possible prison time, and the civil rights charges alone could lead to up to 10 years in federal prison. Officer Thompson faced 6 similar charges. Even though he didn't start the confrontation, his role in the illegal search and his failure to stop his partner's obvious misconduct made him just as responsible under federal law. But the charges against the 2 officers were only the beginning. The Department of Justice announced that the entire police department would be placed under federal oversight. A consent decree would control their operations for the next 5 years, with policies and procedures requiring federal approval. The cost would reach millions of dollars, and it would all come out of the city's budget. The financial disaster hit immediately. The city's insurance company canceled their police liability coverage, saying the federal investigation showed deep, system-wide problems. Without that insurance, the city could face bankruptcy if it lost the civil lawsuits that were now almost guaranteed. The mayor called emergency budget meetings as legal costs started piling up fast, and through all of it, Judge Williams went back to her courtroom. But she didn't stay quiet about what had been done to her. She used her role and her public voice to speak openly about what she had gone through. Judge Williams gave interviews to major news networks and testified before congressional committees calling for real police reform. Her message was simple, but it carried great weight. If this could happen to a federal judge inside her own home, what was happening to everyday citizens who did not have her legal knowledge, her resources, or her power to fight back? How many people had suffered the same abuse, but never had proof, protection, or a platform to be heard? That question was answered quickly. As people saw a federal judge stand up and refuse to stay silent, more victims found the courage to come forward. The floodgates opened, and it became clear that the consequences of this case would reach far beyond 2 disgraced officers. Civil lawsuits began just days after the criminal indictment. Judge Williams hired one of the toughest civil rights attorneys in the state, Rebecca Martinez, a lawyer known for taking down police departments that believed they were untouchable. Martinez filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking $15 million in damages, and the evidence supporting the claim was overwhelming. But Judge Williams was far from alone. Once the story went national, her phone would not stop ringing. People who had suffered similar treatment at the hands of officers Reeves and Thompson began calling nonstop. The law firm set up a hotline, and within 2 weeks they had documented 43 separate incidents involving the same two officers. The stories were both heartbreaking and enraging. A black pediatrician had been handcuffed outside the hospital where she worked because Officer Thompson claimed she looked suspicious walking to her car after a late shift. A successful businessman was forced to prove he owned his Mercedes while filling up gas because Officer Reeves insisted someone like him could not afford that car. A college professor was questioned for 20 minutes about whether she really lived in her neighborhood simply because the officers saw her picking up her mail. Every story followed the same pattern. Successful black citizens going about their normal lives were targeted for one reason, only the color of their skin and the belief that they did not belong where they were. Many had filed complaints at the time, but those reports vanished inside the department's internal system without any real action being taken. Federal prosecutor David Chen realized something critical. He was no longer dealing with just two bad officers. This was a systemic pattern of civil rights violations, ignored and protected by leadership within the department. He expanded the investigation to include supervisors who had dismissed clear warning signs and administrators who had allowed the behavior to continue unchecked. Do you think this kind of behavior happens more often than we realize? Share your thoughts in the comments. The criminal trial of officers Reeves and Thompson began 6 months after the incident at Judge Williams's home. The courthouse was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and community members who had waited years to see real accountability. The two defendants sat at separate tables with expensive defense attorneys, both looking like men who knew their lives were effectively over. The prosecution's case was powerful because it was simple. Jurors were shown the crystal-clear security footage from Judge Williams's home. They watched every second of the illegal entry and search. They listened to the audio recordings of racial slurs and threats. They saw proof that the so-called suspicious person report had never existed and that the entire encounter was based on a lie. Judge Williams testified for 6 hours spread over 2 days. She carefully walked the jury through every moment of that morning. She explained how her constitutional rights were violated and described the fear she felt when armed officers forced their way into her home. She spoke about the humiliation of being told she did not belong in her own neighborhood, and the anger of hearing racial slurs spoken inside her living room. Her testimony was calm, professional, and devastating. Here was a federal judge, someone who had spent her life enforcing the law, explaining how two officers had crushed the very principles they were sworn to protect. The jury listened in complete silence, hanging on every word. The defense attorneys tried desperately to save their clients. Officer Reeves's lawyer claimed his client was simply following training and responding to what he believed was a suspicious situation. That argument collapsed when prosecutors proved no report had ever been made and that Reeves himself admitted he had fabricated the reason for the stop. Officer Thompson's attorney argued that his client was just following his partner's lead and did not fully understand what was happening. That defense fell apart when jurors heard audio of Thompson actively joining in the racial abuse and illegal search. Some of the most damaging testimony came from former officers who had worked with both men. 3 retired police officers took the stand and described a culture of racism inside the department. They told the jury about specific times they had seen Reeves and Thompson target black citizens. One former sergeant testified that he had tried to report concerns but was told by supervisors to mind his own business. Expert witnesses explained the legal rules governing police conduct and showed exactly how every action taken by the defendants violated federal law. A constitutional law professor broke down the Fourth Amendment and explained how those protections had been completely destroyed that Tuesday morning. The defense case lasted less than 2 days. Neither Reeves nor Thompson testified likely because their lawyers knew they would fall apart under questioning. Character witnesses tried to describe them as good men who made mistakes, but their words meant little compared to the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was fast and absolute. Guilty on all counts. Officer Reeves was convicted on all 7 federal charges. Officer Thompson was convicted on 6. Together, they faced a possible sentence of more than 20 years in federal prison. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Family members of other victims broke down in tears, finally seeing justice they had waited years for. Judge Williams sat quietly in the front row of the courtroom. She showed no emotion on her face, but it was clear she felt vindicated. Across the room, the families of the defendants looked crushed, finally realizing that their loved ones were about to spend many years in prison. But the guilty verdicts were only the beginning of the consequences these officers would face. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. Federal Judge Robert Chen, no relation to the prosecutor, had carefully reviewed every piece of evidence and every victim impact statement. He had handled hundreds of criminal cases over his career, but he made it clear that this one was different. He said the case stood out because of how bold the constitutional violations were, and because the defendants showed absolutely no remorse for their actions. Before sentencing, Judge Williams was given the opportunity to speak. She stood at the podium and addressed the two officers directly. Neither of them could look her in the eye. She told them their actions had not only violated her rights, but had deeply damaged the trust between law enforcement and the community. She explained that their behavior made it harder for good officers to do their jobs and reinforced the worst fears people already had about police racism. She then spoke about the larger impact of what they had done. Every black citizen who heard about this case would now question whether they were truly safe in their own neighborhoods and homes. Every parent would be forced to explain to their children why some police officers might see them as threats simply because of their skin color. Her statement lasted 20 minutes. When she finished, the courtroom was completely silent. Judge Chen then delivered the sentence as Officer Reeves was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole. Officer Thompson received 12 years. Both men were sent to federal prisons far from their home state, partly for their own safety. Convicted police officers are not treated kindly behind bars, and everyone in the system knew that. The sentences sent shockwaves through law enforcement across the country. 15 years for a single incident of racial profiling was unheard of. Legal experts called it a turning point, one that would force officers everywhere to think twice about their actions. Police unions criticized the sentences as too harsh, while civil rights groups celebrated them as long overdue accountability. 3 weeks after the criminal sentencing, the civil lawsuit was settled. The city agreed to pay Judge Williams $12 million, the largest individual police misconduct settlement in the state's history. The insurance company that had canceled the city's coverage was forced to pay under the previous policy, then immediately sued the city for failing to address long-known problems within the department. But the settlement was about much more than money. Judge Williams demanded real, lasting change. The agreement required the police department to undergo major reforms under federal supervision. Every officer would receive extensive bias training. The complaint system would be completely rebuilt with civilian oversight. Body cameras would become mandatory during all public interactions. Most importantly, a civilian review board with real investigative power was created. Judge Williams insisted on becoming the first chair of that board, using her position to make sure the reforms were not just promises on paper. Other victims targeted by Reeves and Thompson filed their own lawsuits. Over the next year, the city paid an additional $38 million in settlements. The financial pressure led to massive budget cuts and forced the resignation of the mayor, the police chief, and 3 city council members who had ignored years of warning signs. Officer Reeves began serving his sentence in a federal prison in another state. Within his first month, he was attacked by inmates who recognized him from the news. He spent the rest of his sentence in protective custody, essentially solitary confinement, for 15 years. His wife divorced him within 6 months and moved across the country with their children. Officer Thompson's fate was similar. 12 years of isolation, broken family ties, and the knowledge that his own racism had cost him everything. Both men would eventually leave prison as convicted felons, unemployable, infamous, and remembered only for what they had done. The police department they left behind was completely transformed. Federal oversight meant every policy, procedure, and new hire required approval from Justice Department monitors. The old culture of protecting bad officers was replaced with strict accountability. Complaints were investigated by independent civilians instead of fellow officers. Training programs were rebuilt with help from civil rights groups and community leaders. Officers were taught not only constitutional law, but also implicit bias, de-escalation skills, and community policing. The goal was to change how officers viewed their role not as enforcers over a community but as partners within it. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Veteran officers complained about the increased oversight and paperwork. Some chose early retirement rather than adapt. But recruitment improved as the department's reputation slowly recovered, and more diverse candidates applied to join a reformed force. Judge Williams continued serving as a federal judge, but her experience had changed how she approached cases involving police misconduct. She became known for asking hard questions and ensuring that constitutional violations led to real consequences. 3 years after the incident at her home, she was invited to speak at the FBI Academy. Her message to new agents was clear and powerful. The law applies to everyone, and those who swear to uphold it must be held to the highest standards when they break it. The case became a landmark in civil rights law. studied in law schools and police academies across the country. The security footage from Judge Williams's home was used nationwide to show officers exactly what constitutional violations look like and what they can cause. But the most important impact was felt in the community. People who had suffered in silence for years now knew their voices mattered. The Civilian Review Board, Judge Williams, helped investigate every complaint thoroughly and released detailed public reports. The message was unmistakable. Racial profiling would not be tolerated, no matter who the target was or who the officer happened to be. Justice had finally arrived in a community that had waited far too long. 2 officers believed they could intimidate someone they thought was powerless, someone who wouldn't fight back or hold them accountable. They were catastrophically wrong. Judge Patricia Williams proved that actions have consequences, that evidence matters, and that even federal judges are not immune to the prejudice that exists within the justice system. Her decision to fight back did more than end 2 careers and send 2 men to prison. It reshaped an entire police department and sent a message that echoed across the nation. Justice can be slow. It can be uncertain. But when brave people stand up for what is right, the outcome can be devastating for those who believed they were untouchable. This case was intense. But the next one is even more unbelievable.